The knock never came. Instead, there was a heavy thud against the porch railing, followed by a groan that made Noelle Ashgrove drop the kettle she was holding. Water hissed across the stove as she rushed to the window, her heart slamming against her ribs. Through the rain-streaked glass, she saw a shape crumpled at the bottom of her porch steps, one arm stretched toward the door, as if reaching for help that might never come. She should have called the sheriff. That was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing, the thing any reasonable woman living alone at the edge of a quiet town would do. Instead, she grabbed her coat, threw open the door, and stepped into the storm without a second thought. The man was soaked through, his shirt torn and dark with blood along his side. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead, and his eyes fluttered open just enough to focus on her face, before rolling back again. He was tall, broad-shouldered, maybe in his early 30s, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was the blood soaking through his shirt, and the way his breathing came in short, ragged pulls. "Hey," she said, crouching beside him, rain running down her own face. "Hey, can you hear me?" His eyes opened again, unfocused, searching. His lips moved, but no sound came out except a hoarse whisper that might have been a name, or maybe just a groan of pain. Noelle glanced toward the road. It was empty, dark, the kind of countryside road that saw maybe 3 cars a day. No headlights, no sirens, nothing but rain hammering the gravel and wind bending the trees along her fence line. Whoever had done this to him was gone, or hiding, or worse, still coming. She made her decision in less than 5 seconds. Some decisions, she would learn later, take 5 seconds and change everything that comes after. "Okay," she said, more to herself than to him. "Okay, let's get you inside." He was heavier than he looked, dead weight against her shoulder as she hauled him up the steps one painful inch at a time. By the time she got him through the front door, her arms were shaking and her breath came out in short bursts that matched his own. She laid him down on the rug near the fireplace because the couch would never survive the blood, and immediately went to work. Noelle had not touched a first aid kit with any real purpose in years, not since she left the life that taught her these skills, the life she had worked so hard to bury. But the training never really leaves a person. Her hands remembered before her mind caught up. She tore his shirt open, found the wound low on his side, and pressed a clean towel against it hard enough to make him cry out. "I know," she muttered. "I know it hurts. Stay with me." His eyes opened again, clearer this time, locking onto hers with an intensity that startled her. "Don't," he rasped. "Don't call anyone. You're bleeding out on my floor. I should call an ambulance right now." "No." His hand shot up and gripped her wrist, weak but insistent. "No hospitals, no police, please." Every instinct told her this was the moment to ignore him, to reach for her phone anyway, because a man begging you not to call for help after being shot was not a man living an ordinary life. But there was something in his eyes, something desperate and human beneath the danger, that made her hesitate. "Fine," she said finally, "but you're going to tell me what happened." He didn't answer. His eyes closed again, and for one terrifying second, she thought she had lost him. Then his chest rose, shallow but steady, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She worked through the next hour with the kind of focus that blocked out everything else, the storm outside, the questions piling up in her mind, even the strange thrill of fear humming beneath her skin. She cleaned the wound, packed it, stitched what she could with a sewing kit that had never been used for anything more serious than a torn hem. The bullet, thankfully, had passed through cleanly, missing anything vital by what felt like a miracle. By the time she finished, her hands were stained red and her back ached from bending over him on the hard floor. She sat back on her heels and studied him properly for the first time. Even unconscious, there was something commanding about his face, a stillness that suggested he was used to being obeyed rather than questioned. His clothes, despite being ruined, were expensive, tailored. A thin silver chain hung around his neck, tucked beneath his collar. This was not a man who had wandered into trouble by accident. This was a man trouble had been hunting. Noelle pulled a blanket from the hall closet and draped it over him, then moved to the window again, peering out at the empty road. The rain was easing now, turning from a downpour into a steady drizzle. Nothing moved out there except the trees. She should not have felt safe, and yet, for a strange moment, sitting in her small farmhouse with a stranger bleeding on her floor and the storm calming outside, she did. That feeling did not last. Around 3 in the morning, a sound pulled her from the shallow doze she had fallen into in the armchair beside him. It was faint at first, easy to mistake for wind, but then it came again, a low hum of an engine somewhere down the road. She rose quietly and crossed to the window. Headlights, far off but moving slowly, sweeping the darkness like they were searching for something, or someone. Her pulse spiked. She glanced back at the man on her floor, his chest still rising and falling, his face pale but peaceful in sleep. Whoever was out there, she had a sick feeling they were looking for him. The headlights paused near the end of her driveway. For a long, agonizing moment, they simply sat there, engine idling, and Noelle held her breath so hard her lungs burned. Then, slowly, the car rolled forward, and instead of turning down her drive, it continued past, tail lights shrinking into the dark until they disappeared entirely. She exhaled and pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart hammer beneath her palm. It was nothing, just a car. Probably someone lost, or a farmer checking on cattle before dawn. She told herself this several times, trying to make herself believe it, but she did not sleep again that night. By the time grey light began to creep over the hills, Noelle had made a full pot of coffee, changed out of her blood-streaked clothes, and checked the stranger's bandages twice more. His fever had not spiked, which she took as a good sign, though she was no doctor and knew her limits well. She was standing at the kitchen window, mug in hand, when she saw the first car. It rolled to a stop at the very edge of her property, engine cutting off, and 2 men stepped out. They did not approach the house. They simply stood by the car, scanning the fields, the barn, the tree line, with the kind of quiet, practiced attention that made her stomach twist. A second car appeared minutes later, parking on the opposite side of the road, then a third. By the time the sun had fully risen, there were at least 6 vehicles positioned at various points around her property, spaced out like they were forming a perimeter. Nobody approached, nobody knocked. They simply watched, waited, and made sure nothing came in or out without their notice. Noelle's hands trembled around her mug as she stared out at them. She thought of the stranger sleeping in her living room, his silver chain, his tailored clothes, his desperate plea not to call anyone. She thought of the phrase that kept circling through her mind, the one she hadn't wanted to admit until now. She had not saved a stranger last night. She had saved someone very important to somebody, and now, whoever that somebody was, they had found him. A floorboard creaked behind her, and she spun around so fast, her coffee sloshed over the rim of the mug. The stranger stood in the doorway of the kitchen, one hand braced against the frame, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes sharp and alert in a way they hadn't been the night before. He looked at her, then past her, toward the window, and something in his expression shifted from confusion to grim understanding. "They found me," he said quietly. "Who?" Noelle demanded, setting the mug down with a shaking hand. "Found you? Who are you?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face like he was weighing how much truth she could handle, or maybe how much truth would keep her safest. Finally, he straightened, wincing at the pull of his stitches, and met her eyes directly. "My name is Dante," he said, "and I need you to trust me for just a little longer, because right now, those men outside are the only reason either of us might survive the day." Noelle felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet. Outside, another car pulled up, then another, the quiet countryside road she had lived on for 3 peaceful years, slowly filling with vehicles she did not recognize, and men she had never seen, all of them watching her small farmhouse like it was the center of something enormous. She thought about the sheriff's number saved in her phone, about how easy it would be to press call right now, while Dante was too weak to stop her. She thought about the blood she had washed from her hands twice already, and still felt clinging to her skin. She thought about the choice she had made in 5 seconds the night before, and how those 5 seconds now stretched out in front of her like the edge of a cliff she had already stepped off. "Start talking," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Right now, everything. Dante glanced toward the window one more time, watching a man in a dark coat pace slowly along her fence line, scanning the property with the focus of someone trained to notice everything out of place. Then he turned back to Noelle, and for the first time since she'd pulled him off her porch steps, real fear flickered across his face, not for himself, she realized, but for her. "They're not here to hurt me," he said quietly. "Not yet. They're here because I'm the reason a war might be starting. And you, Noelle, just became part of it whether you wanted to or not." Behind him, through the kitchen window, a seventh car rolled to a stop at the edge of her driveway, and a man stepped out who moved differently than the others, unhurried, certain, like a man who already knew exactly how the next few hours were going to go. Noelle watched him approach the porch steps, the same steps she had dragged Dante up just hours before, and she realized with a cold, sinking certainty that whatever was coming next, there would be no undoing the choice she had already made. The man on the porch steps did not knock right away. He stood there for a long moment, hands loose at his sides, studying the house the way someone studies a puzzle they already know the answer to. Noelle watched him through the window, her breath fogging the glass, while behind her, Dante leaned heavily against the kitchen counter, his face gone pale again from the effort of standing. "That's Salvatore," Dante said quietly. "Sal, my cousin. If he's the one they sent first, that means they're being careful." "Careful," Noelle repeated, her voice tight. "You call an army parked around my house careful?" "I call it restraint," Dante said. "If they wanted to storm in, they already would have." Before she could respond, 3 knocks sounded on the front door, slow and deliberate. Noelle's hand hovered near the kitchen drawer, where she kept an old handgun she hadn't touched in years, a leftover habit from a life she rarely spoke about. Dante noticed the movement and shook his head slightly. "Let him in," he said. "It's the only way this ends peacefully." She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to refuse, to barricade the door, to call someone, anyone, who might actually help her out of this nightmare. But there was something steady in Dante's voice, something that told her he had navigated moments like this before, and knew, better than she did, which choices kept people alive. She crossed the living room and opened the door. Salvatore Corvetti was not what she expected. He looked like an ordinary man in his late 30s, dressed simply, with tired eyes, and the kind of weathered calm that came from years of cleaning up other people's chaos. But the moment his gaze landed on Dante behind her, relief broke across his face so suddenly and completely that Noelle's suspicion softened, just slightly. "You're alive," Sal breathed, stepping past Noelle without waiting for an invitation. He crossed the room and gripped Dante's shoulders carefully, checking him over with the practiced eye of someone who had seen injuries like this before. "We thought Renzo's men finished the job." "Not this time," Dante said grimly. "This woman saved my life." Sal turned to look at Noelle properly for the first time, and she felt herself being assessed, measured, weighed against some invisible scale of trust and threat. Whatever conclusion he reached, he kept it hidden behind a neutral expression. "You didn't call anyone," Sal said. "It wasn't a question." "He asked me not to," Noelle said, crossing her arms, which, in hindsight, might have been a mistake. "No," Sal said, surprising her. "It might have saved both your lives, if word got out through official channels that Dante was alive and recovering at a civilian's house. Renzo's people would have found him within the hour. Silence bought you time." "Time for what?" Noelle demanded, her patience finally cracking. "Somebody want to explain what exactly happened last night, and why there are enough cars parked around my house to start a used car lot?" Dante and Sal exchanged a glance, some silent conversation passing between them, before Dante gestured for her to sit. She didn't. She stood in the middle of her own living room, with her arms crossed, waiting. "My family runs a business," Dante said carefully. "It's not the kind of business you'll find in any directory. We've had an uneasy peace with another family for the past several years, run by a man named Renzo Falcone. 2 nights ago, that peace ended. Renzo made a move to take territory that belongs to us, and last night, his men ambushed my car on the road just past your property. I got out, barely. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, and then I found your porch." Noelle absorbed this in silence, her mind racing through the implications. A crime family, a war, men with guns circling her house like wolves around a wounded deer. She thought of her quiet life here, the small inn she ran down the road, the garden she tended every morning, the peaceful boredom she had worked so hard to build after leaving everything dangerous behind her. All of it now hung in the balance because she had chosen, in 5 seconds of instinct, to save a stranger's life. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. "Renzo knows Dante survived. What's stopping him from sending men here to finish what they started?" "Nothing," Sal admitted, "which is why we need to move him, tonight, if possible, somewhere secure, somewhere Renzo's people can't easily find." "He can't be moved," Noelle said sharply, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "He's lost too much blood. The stitches are barely holding. If you put him in a car and drive him anywhere right now, you could kill him faster than any gunman." Both men looked at her, and for a moment nobody spoke. Sal's expression shifted into something more calculating, reassessing her not as a bystander, but as someone who apparently knew what she was talking about. "You have medical training," Sal said slowly. "I have a past," Noelle said, which was true and also carefully incomplete. "That's all you need to know." Dante watched her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and quiet respect. "She's right," he said finally, turning to Sal. "Moving me now is a risk we can't afford. We need to secure this location instead." Sal's jaw tightened. "That means turning her house into a target." "It already is a target," Dante said grimly. "The only question is whether we defend it properly or leave it exposed." Noelle felt her stomach drop. She had spent the last 3 years building a life defined by quiet, by distance, by the deliberate absence of danger. Now, in the span of one storm and one bleeding stranger, that life was collapsing into something she recognized far too well, something she had promised herself she would never return to. "This is insane," she said, more to herself than to either of them. "This is completely insane." "You're right," Dante said quietly, "and I'm sorry. I never meant to bring this to your door. If there had been anywhere else to run last night, I would have gone there instead." Something about the sincerity in his voice cut through her rising panic, just enough to let her think clearly again. She looked at him properly, really looked, past the danger and the blood and the impossible circumstances, and saw exhaustion and guilt and something achingly human beneath the composed exterior he was struggling to maintain. "You didn't choose to almost die on my porch," she said finally. "That wasn't your fault, but now that you're here, we need a plan, not an apology." Sal looked between them, something shifting in his expression, though he said nothing. Over the next hour, Noelle watched her quiet farmhouse transform into something resembling a command post. Sal made calls, low and urgent, arranging for more men, more resources, more eyes on every possible entry point to her property. Dante, despite his weakened state, insisted on being part of every decision, propped up on her couch, with a fresh bandage and a stubborn refusal to rest. Noelle busied herself boiling water, gathering supplies, checking Dante's wound every 20 minutes whether he wanted her to or not. It gave her hands something to do while her mind spun through the impossible turn her life had taken. She thought about calling Marguerite, her closest friend and neighbor, to warn her to stay away, but every version of that conversation ended with more questions than she could safely answer. Around midday, Sal approached her in the kitchen, his expression more guarded than before. "We've confirmed Renzo knows Dante is alive," he said quietly. "One of our men spotted a car with his people, watching from the tree line about a mile out. They haven't approached, but they will. When? Tonight, most likely. Renzo won't wait long once he confirms the location." Noelle set down the cloth she'd been using to clean her hands and looked directly at him. "Then we need to be ready before tonight." Sal studied her for a long moment, something like reluctant approval crossing his face. "You're taking this better than most people would." "I'm not taking it well," she corrected. "I'm just refusing to fall apart while there's still work to be done." He nodded slowly, and something unspoken passed between them, a fragile thread of trust neither of them had expected to form so quickly. By late afternoon, the perimeter around Noelle's house had grown tighter, more organized, cars repositioned to cover every angle of approach. Dante insisted on being moved to a chair near the window, arguing that he needed to see what was happening rather than lying blind on the couch. Noel didn't fight him on it, sensing that some battles weren't worth the energy they'd cost. As the sun began sinking toward the hills, painting the sky in deep orange and violet, Noel stood on her porch wrapped in a jacket against the evening chill, watching the men stationed along her fence line settle into position for what was coming. Dante appeared beside her, moving slower than before but steadier than she expected. "You should be resting," she said without looking at him. "I should be a lot of things," he replied. "Grateful is one of them." "I haven't said that properly yet." She glanced at him then, taking in the sharp lines of his face softened by the fading light, the weariness in his eyes that no amount of composure could fully hide. "You don't need to thank me. I made a choice. I'd probably make it again, even knowing what it's cost you." Noel considered the question honestly before answering. "Ask me again after tonight," she said. "Ask me again once I know whether we survive it." Dante's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary before he turned back toward the darkening tree line, where somewhere out in the shadows, Renzo Falcone's men were almost certainly watching, waiting, counting down the hours until the quiet countryside around her house erupted into something neither of them could take back. The wind picked up, rustling through the fields, carrying with it the unmistakable feeling that whatever peace remained in this moment was only borrowed, and the clock counting down to the next confrontation had already begun. Night settled over the farmhouse like a held breath. Noel stood at the kitchen window long after Dante had reluctantly agreed to rest, watching shapes move between the trees at the edge of her property, dark silhouettes against darker shadows. She counted them out of habit, an old instinct resurfacing after years of dormancy, tallying positions and estimating distances the way she once had been trained to do. Sal found her there sometime past 10, 2 mugs of coffee in his hands, offering her one without a word. She accepted it, grateful for the warmth against the chill that had settled into her bones, though she suspected the cold had less to do with the weather and more to do with everything unfolding around her. "You keep watching the tree line like you know what you're looking for," Sal said, leaning against the counter beside her. "Maybe I do," she said, sipping the coffee. "Old habits." "Dante mentioned you had a past," Sal said carefully. He didn't elaborate. "I'm guessing you'd prefer to keep it that way." Noel allowed herself a small, humorless smile. "I spent some years doing work that required me to notice things most people overlook. Patterns, weak points, the kind of details that keep you alive when things go wrong. I left that life behind a long time ago. I never expected it to find me again. And yet here you are," Sal said, counting shadows in the dark like it's second nature. "Here I am," she agreed quietly. They stood in silence for a while, watching the tree line together, until Sal's radio crackled softly against his hip. He answered it in low, clipped tones, listening intently before responding with a single word of acknowledgement. When he lowered the radio, his expression had hardened. "Movement," he said. "Northeast corner, near the old barn. At least 4 of Renzo's men, maybe more." Noel's pulse quickened, though she kept her voice steady. "What do we do?" "We hold the line," Sal said, "and we hope Renzo is testing our defenses rather than launching a full assault." But hope, Noel was learning quickly, was a fragile thing in a night like this. Within minutes, the quiet countryside erupted into controlled chaos. Voices crackled over radios, men shifted positions along the fence line, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the barn, the first gunshot cracked through the night air like a whip. Noel flinched instinctively, coffee sloshing over her hand, though the burn barely registered against the adrenaline flooding her system. "Get inside," Sal ordered, already moving toward the door, weapon drawn. "Stay low, stay away from the windows." Noel didn't argue, but she also didn't retreat to some passive corner of the house to wait helplessly for news. Instead, she moved to Dante's side, finding him already awake, struggling to rise from the couch despite his injuries. "You need to lie down," she said firmly, pressing a hand against his shoulder. "Renzo's men are on the property," Dante said, ignoring her completely as he reached for a weapon Sal had left within his reach earlier that day. "I'm not lying here while people fight because of me." "You can barely stand," she protested. "I can aim from a chair," he said grimly. "That will have to be enough." Outside, the exchange of gunfire intensified, sharp cracks echoing across the fields, punctuated by shouted commands, and the occasional flash of light visible through gaps in the curtains. Noelle's heart hammered against her ribs, every instinct screaming at her to hide, to make herself small and invisible until the danger passed. But another instinct, older and more stubborn, refused to let her simply wait in fear while chaos unfolded around her. She moved to the window nearest the barn, peering carefully through a narrow gap in the curtains. In the moonlight, she could make out shapes moving low along the fence line, some belonging to Dante's men, others clearly not, their movements more erratic, less coordinated. "They're pushing toward the house," she said, her voice tight. Dante struggled upright in his chair, weapon steadied despite the visible strain on his face. "How many?" "I count 6, maybe more further back." "Sal has 8 men positioned around the perimeter," Dante said. "If they hold their ground, we can weather this." But holding ground, Noelle quickly realized, was easier said than accomplished. The gunfire grew closer, more frequent, and through the window she watched one of Dante's men stumble and fall near the barn, though whether from injury or tactical retreat she couldn't tell in the darkness and confusion. A sudden crash sounded from the back of the house, glass shattering somewhere near the kitchen. Noelle's blood ran cold. "They're trying to flank us," Dante said grimly, already pushing himself up from the chair despite her protests. "Noelle, get down, now." She dropped low just as a figure appeared in the hallway doorway, silhouetted against the shattered kitchen window behind him. Dante fired before she could fully process what was happening, the shot echoing painfully loud in the enclosed space. The figure crumpled, and Noelle's ears rang with the aftermath, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Noelle," Dante's voice cut through the ringing, urgent and controlled despite everything. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to find words yet, staring at the fallen figure in her hallway, with a kind of detached horror that came from watching violence unfold in a space that had, until yesterday, only ever known quiet mornings and the smell of fresh coffee. Outside, the gunfire began to taper, replaced by shouted commands and the distant sound of engines revving, tires spinning against gravel as vehicles retreated into the darkness. Sal appeared in the doorway moments later, breathing hard, a shallow cut above his eyebrow, the only visible sign of the chaos he'd just weathered. "They're pulling back," he said, glancing around the room, his gaze landing on the fallen intruder in the hallway before flicking to Dante and Noelle. "For now." "For now," Dante repeated grimly, lowering himself back into the chair, exhaustion finally overtaking the adrenaline that had kept him upright. Noelle finally found her voice, though it came out shakier than she intended. "That was a test, wasn't it? Renzo wasn't trying to finish this tonight." "No," Sal confirmed, moving to check on Dante's condition with visible concern. "He was testing our defenses, gauging our numbers, our response time. The real assault will come once he's confident he can overwhelm us." "And when will that be?" Sal's expression darkened. "Soon, probably within the next day or two, once he's confirmed exactly what he's dealing with here." Noelle sank onto the arm of the couch, suddenly aware of how violently her hands were shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. She looked at the shattered kitchen window, the fallen intruder still lying motionless in her hallway, the blood beginning to seep into the floorboards she had scrubbed clean just hours before. Her quiet, peaceful life had transformed into a battlefield in less than 24 hours, and there was no undoing any of it now. "I need air," she said abruptly, standing and moving toward the front door, despite Sal's protest that it wasn't safe. Dante caught her wrist gently as she passed, his grip weaker than it would have been a day ago, but still firm enough to make her pause. "Noelle." She turned to look at him, finding something raw and apologetic in his expression that cut through her rattled nerves. "I never wanted this for you," he said quietly. "Any of it. I should have kept running last night instead of collapsing on your porch." "You didn't have a choice," she said, echoing what she'd told him earlier, though the words felt heavier now, weighted by everything that had happened since. And neither did I, not really. Not once I saw you bleeding in the rain. They stood there for a moment, something unspoken passing between them, forged in the crucible of violence, and shared danger in a way that felt both fragile and undeniable. Then Noelle gently pulled her wrist free and stepped out onto the porch, needing distance from the wreckage inside to steady her own thoughts. The night air was cold and sharp, carrying the metallic scent of gunpowder, even as the stars above remained indifferent to everything that had just unfolded beneath them. Noelle wrapped her arms around herself, staring out at the dark fields where, somewhere beyond the tree line, Renzo Falcone was already planning his next move. She thought about her life before last night, the careful, quiet existence she had built brick by brick after leaving everything dangerous behind her. She thought about how quickly that life had unraveled, not through any fault of her own choosing, but through one instinctive decision made in the space of 5 seconds during a storm. And yet, standing there in the aftermath of gunfire and shattered glass, she realized she did not regret it. Not the choice to save him, not the danger it had brought crashing into her life. Something had shifted inside her over the past day, some dormant part of herself reawakening after years of careful suppression, and she was not entirely sure she wanted to bury it again, even if she could. Behind her, the front door opened quietly, and Sal stepped out onto the porch, his expression grim in the moonlight. "We need to talk about tomorrow," he said, "because if Renzo comes back with everything he has, we're going to need every advantage possible to survive it." Noelle turned to face him, drawing a steadying breath, feeling the old instincts settle more firmly into place beneath her skin. "Then let's talk," she said, "because I didn't survive one storm just to lose everything in the next." Somewhere in the darkness beyond the fence line, an engine started, distant and deliberate, a reminder that the true confrontation was still waiting, gathering strength, ready to descend upon the farmhouse the moment Renzo Falcone decided the time was right. Dawn arrived pale and gray, the kind of light that offered no comfort, only clarity about how much work remained. Noelle hadn't slept, though she suspected no one in the house had. She stood in the kitchen surveying the damage from the night before, the shattered window now covered with a makeshift board, dark stains on the floorboards that no amount of scrubbing had fully erased. Sal had spent the early hours coordinating with additional men who arrived before sunrise, their faces grim and focused as they fortified positions around the property. Dante, against everyone's advice, had insisted on being present for every strategic discussion, propped in a chair near the kitchen table, with color slowly returning to his face, despite the exhaustion evident in his eyes. "Renzo will come tonight," Sal said, spreading a rough map of the property across the table. "He's had enough time to assess our numbers. He won't wait longer than that." "How many men does he have?" Noelle asked, surprising herself with how naturally the question came, how easily she had slipped back into a mindset she thought she'd abandoned years ago. "Estimates put him at 15 to 20, Sal said. "We have 12, including Dante, though he shouldn't be fighting in his condition." "I'll fight if it comes to that," Dante said firmly, leaving no room for argument. Noelle studied the map, tracing the property lines with her finger, identifying weak points and potential approach routes with an ease that clearly surprised both men watching her. "Your northeast corner is exposed," she said. "The old barn provides cover for anyone approaching from that direction, but it also blocks your sight line from the house. If I were planning an assault, that's where I'd concentrate my forces." Sal exchanged a glance with Dante, something unspoken passing between them, before he turned back to Noelle with renewed interest. "You keep proving you know more about this than you've let on." "I told you," Noelle said, straightening. "I have a past. It's not something I discuss, but it means I understand exactly what we're facing here, maybe better than either of you realize." Dante watched her with an expression that mixed curiosity, respect, and something warmer underneath it all, something neither of them had acknowledged directly since the confrontation the night before. "Then help us prepare properly," he said, "because if you see weaknesses we've missed, we need to know now, not after Renzo exploits them." For the next several hours, Noelle worked alongside Sal and Dante, drawing on instincts and knowledge she had spent years trying to forget, repositioning defenses, identifying blind spots, coordinating with the men stationed around the property, in a way that left even Sal visibly impressed by her competence. It felt strange, uncomfortable even, to slip back into this version of herself so easily, like putting on an old coat that still somehow fit despite years of disuse. Around midday, while reviewing final preparations near the barn, Noelle found herself alone with Dante for the first time since the chaos of the previous night. He moved slower than before, favoring his injured side, but there was a steadiness returning to him that hadn't been there when she first dragged him through her front door. "You never asked me why I have this training," she said quietly, watching him check the barn's rear entrance for vulnerabilities. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready," Dante replied, "or not at all. Either way, it's not my place to push." Noelle appreciated that more than she expected to, the restraint, the respect for boundaries she hadn't asked him to honor, but that he offered anyway. "I worked in security consulting," she said finally, offering him a piece of truth she rarely shared with anyone. "High-risk protection work. I was good at it, too good, eventually. I lost someone I was responsible for protecting, and after that, I couldn't do the work anymore. I moved here to disappear, to build something quiet and safe." Dante's expression softened with understanding rather than pity, which she appreciated even more. "And now you're back in the middle of exactly the kind of danger you tried to leave behind." "Now I'm back," she agreed, "and strangely, I don't hate it as much as I expected to." He looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made her pulse quicken despite the exhaustion and danger surrounding them both. "I'm sorry for what this has cost you," he said, "but I'm not sorry you found me that night. Whatever happens with Renzo, I want you to know that." Before she could respond, Sal's voice cut through the moment, calling them back toward the house for a final briefing before nightfall. The instant passed, unfinished but not forgotten, tucked away beneath the more urgent business of survival. As afternoon shifted toward evening, tension coiled tighter around the farmhouse with every passing hour. Noelle found herself checking weapons alongside Sal's men, reviewing escape routes, preparing medical supplies for injuries she desperately hoped wouldn't be needed. Dante, despite his weakened state, positioned himself near the front window, weapon steady in his hands, his focus entirely on the tree line where Renzo's forces were undoubtedly gathering. Marguerite called around 6 in the evening, her voice bright and oblivious on the other end of the line, inviting Noelle to dinner later that week. Noelle kept her voice steady, deflecting with practiced ease, urging her friend to stay away from the farmhouse for the next few days, without offering any explanation that might alarm her. When she hung up, guilt settled heavily in her chest, though she knew it was safer this way, keeping the people she cared about as far from this danger as possible. As darkness fell, the same oppressive quiet from the night before returned, thick and expectant, broken only by the occasional crackle of radios and low-murmured conversations between the men stationed around the property. Noelle stood at the kitchen window once more, watching the tree line with a focus sharpened by exhaustion and adrenaline in equal measure. "They're here," Sal's voice crackled over the radio, tense and urgent. Multiple vehicles, approaching from the north and east simultaneously. The farmhouse erupted into controlled motion, men moving to predetermined positions, weapons readied, voices low but urgent as final preparations fell into place. Dante rose from his chair despite Noelle's protest, positioning himself near the window with grim determination etched across his face. "This is it," he said quietly. "Whatever happens tonight, Noelle, thank you for everything." "Save your thanks," she said, checking the weapon Sal had insisted she carry, despite her initial reluctance. "We're getting through this. All of us." The first shots rang out moments later, distant at first, then rapidly closing distance as Renzo's forces pushed toward the farmhouse with far greater numbers and coordination than the previous night's probing attack. Noelle's training resurfaced fully now, instinct overriding fear as she moved through the house checking angles, calling out warnings, providing cover as Dante's men fought to hold their positions against the advancing assault. Through the chaos, she caught glimpses of Sal directing his men with practiced authority, of Dante steadying his aim despite his injuries, of gunfire flashing bright against the darkness beyond her windows. The farmhouse that had once represented peace and quiet now stood as a fortress under siege, every room echoing with the sounds of a war that had followed Dante straight to her doorstep. A sudden explosion rocked the barn, flames erupting into the night sky, and Noelle's heart lurched as she realized Renzo's forces had brought far more than simple weapons to this confrontation. Smoke began curling toward the house, adding chaos and confusion to an already desperate situation. "They're trying to draw us out," Dante shouted over the din, positioning himself near the doorway. "Don't take the bait. Hold the house." Noelle nodded, moving to reinforce a weakening position near the back entrance, where two of Sal's men were struggling against a concentrated push from Renzo's forces. She fired with steady precision, years of dormant training guiding her hands despite the tremor of adrenaline coursing through her veins, and watched as the attackers were forced to retreat momentarily under the combined defense. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity, but was likely only 20 minutes, chaos and gunfire and shouted commands blending together into a blur of survival instinct and desperate coordination. Slowly, gradually, the tide began to shift as Dante's men held their ground more effectively than Renzo had apparently anticipated, forcing his forces into a disorganized retreat as reinforcements Sal had quietly arranged finally arrived from the main road. When the gunfire finally faded into silence, replaced only by the crackling flames still consuming the barn and the distant wail of sirens finally responding to the chaos, Noelle sank against the kitchen wall, her body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline finally draining from her system. Dante appeared beside her moments later, pale but alive, his weapon lowered, exhaustion and relief warring across his features. "We held," he said quietly, disbelief coloring his voice. "We actually held." "For now," Noelle said, echoing Sal's earlier words, though this time the phrase felt less ominous and more like a fragile promise of survival rather than a warning of worse to come. Dante reached for her hand, his grip weak but sincere, gratitude and something deeper passing between them in the wreckage of the battle they had just survived together. "This isn't over," he said. "Renzo won't accept defeat easily, but tonight, because of you, we're both still standing." Outside, Sal's voice carried through the smoke and chaos, coordinating the aftermath, checking on wounded men, confirming that Renzo's forces had truly retreated rather than regrouping for a second wave. Noelle closed her eyes for just a moment, allowing herself to feel the full weight of everything that had happened, the danger, the fear, the strange and unexpected connection forming between herself and the stranger she had pulled off her porch steps 2 nights ago. Whatever came next, she knew with certainty now that there was no returning to the quiet, uncomplicated life she had built before that storm. The question that remained, hanging heavy in the smoke-filled air around them, was whether the life waiting on the other side of this war was one she was willing to embrace, or one that would cost her everything she had left to give. 3 days passed before Renzo Falcone made his next move, 3 days of uneasy calm that felt more unsettling than the chaos it followed. Noelle spent that time helping coordinate repairs to her property, rebuilding what had been damaged, though some things, she realized, could never fully return to how they had been before the storm that started everything. Dante's recovery progressed steadily, his strength returning day by day, though the weight of leadership and impending confrontation never fully left his shoulders. Sal maintained constant vigilance, certain that Renzo's retreat had been tactical rather than final, a regrouping rather than surrender. On the 4th morning, word arrived that confirmed everyone's suspicions. Renzo had gathered his remaining forces at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, consolidating power, preparing for what intelligence suggested would be a final, decisive strike against Dante's territory, and, by extension, against the farmhouse that had become an unlikely battleground in their ongoing war. "We can't wait for him to come to us again," Dante said, standing at the head of the kitchen table where maps and reports now spread across the surface that had once held nothing more complicated than Noelle's morning coffee. "We end this on our terms, not his." "That means going to him," Sal said grimly. "Which means leaving this location vulnerable." "Then we don't leave it vulnerable," Noelle said, surprising both men with the certainty in her voice. "I stay. With enough men to hold the perimeter, and enough preparation, I can defend this property while you handle Renzo directly." Dante's expression tightened with concern. "Noelle, this isn't your fight. It stopped being just your fight the moment I pulled you off my porch steps," she said firmly. "I'm not asking permission, Dante. I'm telling you how this is going to work." Something shifted in his expression, respect mingling with reluctant acceptance, and he nodded slowly, recognizing the futility of arguing against her resolve. The plan solidified over the following hours, careful and precise, drawing on Noelle's dormant expertise alongside Sal's tactical experience and Dante's intimate knowledge of Renzo's operations. By evening, everything was in place, men positioned strategically both at the farmhouse and along the route toward the warehouse, where the final confrontation would unfold. As Dante prepared to leave, Noelle found him alone in the hallway, checking his weapon with steady, determined hands that no longer trembled from injury or exhaustion. "Come back," she said quietly, the words carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. Dante looked up, something tender breaking through his composed exterior. "I intend to," he said. "There's too much waiting here for me not to." Before she could respond, he closed the distance between them, his hand rising to gently cup her face, and for a moment, the danger and chaos surrounding them faded into something quieter, something that had been building steadily since that first desperate night in the storm. "Whatever happens tonight," he said softly, "I need you to know that finding you wasn't just luck. It was the one good thing that came out of all of this." Then he was gone, moving toward the waiting vehicles with Sal and the remaining men, leaving Noelle standing in the doorway of her farmhouse, watching taillights disappear down the darkened road toward whatever confrontation awaited them at Renzo's warehouse. Will the hours that followed stretched with agonizing slowness. Noelle maintained her position at the farmhouse, radio in hand, monitoring updates that came in fragmented bursts through Sal's careful coordination. The men stationed around her property remained alert, watchful, though the true danger tonight lay elsewhere, in a confrontation she could only track through distant, clipped reports crackling over the radio. Near midnight, the radio finally crackled with news that made her blood run cold. "We've engaged," Sal's voice came through, tense and urgent. "Renzo's forces are heavier than intelligence suggested. We need reinforcements." Noelle's heart pounded as she listened to the chaos unfolding miles away, gunfire and shouted commands bleeding through the radio static, every second stretching into an eternity of uncertainty about whether Dante would survive this final confrontation. Then, abruptly, silence. The radio crackled once more, and Sal's voice returned, breathless but steady. "Renzo's down. Repeat, Renzo is down. His forces are surrendering." Relief flooded through Noelle so intensely her knees nearly buckled, though she forced herself to remain steady, waiting for the confirmation that mattered most. "Dante," she said into the radio, unable to keep the urgency from her voice. "Is Dante all right?" A pause stretched long enough to make her stomach twist with dread, before Dante's own voice finally came through, tired, but very much alive. "I'm here," he said. "It's over, Noelle. It's finally over." The following hours passed in a blur of relief and exhaustion as reports confirmed Renzo's defeat, his forces scattered or surrendered, the war that had descended upon Noelle's quiet life finally reaching its conclusion. When Dante's vehicle finally returned to the farmhouse in the pale hours before dawn, Noelle was waiting on the porch steps, the same steps where this entire impossible journey had begun 5 nights earlier. He approached slowly, exhaustion evident in every movement, but alive, whole, victorious despite the cost. Noelle met him halfway across the yard, and whatever words either of them might have prepared dissolved into something simpler, more immediate, as she closed the remaining distance and wrapped her arms around him without hesitation. "You came back," she murmured against his shoulder. "I told you I would," he said, his arms tightening around her despite his lingering injuries. "I meant it." They stood there together in the quiet aftermath, dawn breaking softly over fields that had witnessed both devastating violence and unexpected connection over the past 5 days. Sal watched from a respectful distance, a small, knowing smile crossing his tired features before he moved to coordinate the final details of Renzo's surrender with the men still gathered around the property. In the days that followed, life slowly began settling into a new rhythm, one that bore little resemblance to the quiet solitude Noel had built before that fateful storm, but one that felt, surprisingly, more complete rather than diminished. Dante remained at the farmhouse as his recovery continued, the danger finally lifted, the perimeter of watchful men gradually dispersing as peace returned to the territory his family controlled. Marguerite finally visited, full of questions about the repaired barn and the unfamiliar man now seemingly living at Noel's farmhouse, though Noel offered only carefully edited truths, protecting her friend from the full weight of what had actually transpired, while allowing her to see the genuine happiness now present in her expression. One evening, weeks after the final confrontation, Noel found Dante standing on the porch steps where their impossible story had begun, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of orange and gold. "I keep thinking about that night," she said, joining him at the railing. "How different everything would be if I'd made a different choice." "Do you regret it?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. "Not for a single second," she said honestly, leaning into the warmth of his presence beside her. "Some choices only take 5 seconds to make, but they end up defining everything that comes after." Dante turned to face her fully, tenderness replacing the exhaustion and danger that had defined so much of their time together since that stormy night. "Then I suppose I owe those 5 seconds everything," he said softly, "including you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the farmhouse and its surrounding fields in gentle twilight, Noel realized that the life she had rebuilt after tragedy, the quiet solitude she had once believed was the only safety she could ever want, had transformed into something far richer through the unexpected arrival of a wounded stranger and the impossible 5 days that followed. The danger was gone now, Renzo defeated, peace restored to the territory Dante's family controlled, but what remained standing in its aftermath was something Noel had never expected to find again, a connection forged not despite the chaos, but somehow because of it, strong enough to weather whatever storms might still lie ahead.